The May 15th, 2025 Forest Grove School District Budget Committee meeting is called to order at 6:01 PM. If everybody could please rise for the flag salute. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. We'll do a quick roll call of board members or budget members present. Brad.
Here.
Mark.
Here.
Christie. Here. Peter.
Yes.
Pete. Here. Pete.
Oh, Pete, I thought you said Pete.
Whoa. Pete, are
Oh,
you?
when she calls Kate, I'll say you. Here, on the record.
Thank you. Nicholas.
Here.
David.
Here.
Jordan.
Here.
Melinda.
Here.
Kate.
I am here.
Thanks. And I am here as well. Do I have a motion to approve tonight's agenda as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Great. All in favor? Aye. Thank you so much. Do I have a motion to approve the May 8th, 2025 meeting minutes as presented?
Madam Chair, so moved.
Great, great. Move to seconded. All in favor? Aye, thank you. Okay, we are going to get started with Eileen and or Dr. West and kind of go over if there's any questions or comments and just some thoughts. Okay?
Yeah, so just a reminder of where we are in the budget process. Tonight, we are at the second budget committee meeting. We do have one more additional meeting that's optional if we need it after tonight. And then from here, it goes to the board for board hearing and adoption.
Okay, and I want to orient us to a topic that we just briefly touched on in the last couple of meetings we have, which is the revenue forecast that comes out quarterly from the state of Oregon. There was one just released yesterday. The one prior to that was released for March. In the revenue forecast that came out yesterday, the state is projecting less revenues than they originally anticipated. You can see the reductions up there on the slide. For general fund and lottery resources, the state is projecting $800 million less than they projected in March. And for CAT tax resources, that's the corporate activity tax, 44 million less in resources than they projected in March. They also projected state reserves to be down 400 million, which means for us that we're unlikely to get more than 11.4 billion in the state school fund. There seems to be some consensus that that number with advocacy would probably stick, the 11.4 billion. But as we've discussed, there were bills moving through the legislature for the special education funding and some additional resources in other areas. Those likely will not gain much traction after this revenue forecast. I do want to note, do you have the PERS in there somewhere else or?
No.
Okay, I do want to note that the governor last week signed into law a little bit of PERS relief. And that's good because we actually had that built into our budget. We were expecting that. Had that not been signed into law prior to this revenue forecast, it may have required us to do some adjustments. So we lucked out a little bit there. It's already baked in, so that's a good thing for us. But we wanted to start here to orient you to the fact that the conservative approach that we are taking to budgeting for this particular cycle is affirmed through forecasts like these. If you're really interested in the entire revenue forecast, you can find it on the state's website. They have both the reporting as well as a slide deck that you can follow along with. There's a lot more information there than this. One more thing I want to highlight before turning it back to Director Clute. Something that was particularly interesting in the forecast is that the state showed us through graphs that in 2008, I think it was, there were more children in the state than there were adults age 65 and older. Today, there are more adults age 65 and older than there are children. So we are an aging state, And what that means for us in terms of enrollment is that we are likely to see declining enrollment for some time. With that, I'll turn it over to Director Clayton. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, is that peculiar to Forest Grove or is that statewide?
Statewide. Yeah, and our own projections show that enrollment will continue to decline and then eventually plateau for at least a few more years. We do see potential for increased enrollment about a decade out, is that right? Yeah, about a decade out. Yes,
Is it usually normal to have decrease in the sped cap and the high post disability when we have this kind of troubles within the state funding? Over the years, is this what happened over the years?
is the decrease in special education funding tied to this?
And then the high cost disability, is this something that usually happens all the time when we are down with our state money?
Yeah.
Do they cut any other programs or do they just go for special?
It's not special ed specifically. I think a better way to say this is that any effort at the legislative level to expend more resources than were already planned is highly unlikely. For us in education, that is particularly impactful to special education bills that we're moving through the legislature. But it would also apply to transportation and housing and emergency services, other public sector entities that we're hoping for additional resources may find it very difficult to acquire those resources in the upcoming biennium.
So the special ed bill that's right now on the table down in Salem might be affected because of that.
It most likely will be affected. If it does come to pass, that's great for us. And at this point, given this revenue, we think that's highly unlikely.
Okay.
So over the last week, we've gotten a few questions, from budget committee members. I think I've reached out to most all of you. And, the next few slides will just go over some of those questions to get those answered. And then from there, we'll have an opportunity for public comment, open discussion, and then it will be, you will have an opportunity to vote for the budget or decide to wait until next week. So if we start going through some of the questions that came out over the last week, one of the questions was really targeted to the IA reductions. And this graph just shows over the last 10 years, it's all classified staff across the entire district with all funding sources. So this is migrant, it's Title I, it's IDA, general fund, all classified staff across the district for the last 10 years. And so you can see we've decreased in enrollment district-wide by 6%, but our classified FTE has increased by almost 56%. So us reducing 11 FTE out of the district's budget in the classified group is still considerably above where we have been in the last several years. And so I just wanted to start with this as to get a little bit of perspective of where we are with our classified staff across the district. And this one just breaks down the classified IAs by building, that include general fund, Title I-A, Measure 98, and SIA classified FTE. It does not include SPED, pre-K, or migrant. So I kind of tried to break out that a little bit. So we could really see by building what the classified FTE allocations are district-wide, and then where those reductions are coming from. The red is where the reductions are. Those are what we would have rolled forward into the budget, and then the green is what did get rolled forward into the budget. These are not equal between buildings by any means. What we did is historically, we've taken the classified FTE and just rolled them forward year over year. You had 1.5 last year, you have 1.5 this year. But we know enrollments changed building by building over the last 10 years. And so we wanted to look at how do we make sure that even with these reductions, buildings have equal or equitable amount of staffing levels between each building for their classified staff. And so you'll see that some buildings got a little bit more of an impact than other buildings, but it's because it's where their starting point was from. So this is just to show
What are the numbers on the left? The 5, 10, 15, 20?
FTE.
Numbers.
Yeah. So they're They're like the IAs at the building. There's 10.
Mhm.
There's gonna be 10 at Cornelius and there was 11. That's
Well,
what
to
that's showing.
To clarify, FTE is not the same as a single individual. So if, for example, we're looking at Cornelius with 10 FTE, that may in fact be 13 people. Because many of our instructional assistants do not work a full 8-hour day. They work 6.5 hours typically, and a few work even less. There are some who work a half day or 2 hours during the day.
So if this is FTE in all those categories at the top, how does, let's say you're cutting, I don't know, two of them from item A. How does that affect the general fund?
The general fund is what got reduced by 11
Yeah, okay.
FTE, so their title allocations would have maintained the same. We did rebalance the SIA allocations with this rebalancing model. But the reductions are coming out of general fund, not title.
Okay, got it.
But that's what you might see like Echo Shop more FTE there than Harvey Clark, even though they have the same amount of students or similar amount of students. It's because they're a title school and so they have additional funding.
Okay, so you're showing, I see what you're, on that graph, you're showing all of the.
All of,
Got it.
yes,
Okay, I understand.
yeah, it does include the title.
Yeah, okay,
Mhm.
I got it.
But so really, it's like when you're saying we don't really hire full-time, it could be like 30 IAs.
Most of them are 6.5 hour IAs. And some buildings, it's a 0.8125 was the reduction, which is a 6.5 hour. Another building was a 2.0, so it's gonna be a couple of FTE, or 3 different bodies, or pieces of multiples. If there was temporary hours added to others.
But your larger point that looking at that number, for example, at the high school, the number of people that are encompassed in that number is actually greater than the number of FTE.
Yeah, well, that's what I was like, for Harvey Clark specifically, that could be 6 people.
Or portions of 6 people. A lot of the times in the buildings, we'll have somebody at, a 6.5 hour IA. We add an extra hour temporary to them. So in the future, they're just gonna maintain at the 6.5 hour, and that's where we can grab that 1 hour temporary that was added to them without doing it right. So in looking at this, we really tried to make sure we could do it with current staffing and current turnover without going into a RIF situation.
And that's pretty much what's happening.
So that's an important point. So this reduction does not indicate a specific risk happening. We're just gonna be dining back hours for people that are already there or letting a trits go unfilled and things like that.
Natural attrition.
Yeah, so to be clear, we are not renewing vacancies, temporary positions. So those contracts, they terminate in June every year anyway, so we're not rolling any forward. That's one way that we are realizing savings. Another way is through vacancy savings. So we have identified some vacancies that we are not going to fill. And then we know we will have attrition, especially in our classified ranks. So over the course of the next several weeks, and probably into the summer, we will monitor closely resignations and retirements. And rather than fill those, we will move people around to make sure that schools are staffed based on our methodology for instructional assistants and other classified support positions until we reach our goal, at which point any further vacancies that arise would actually be posted for hire.
How did we establish the goal? In this case, for what our reductions should be or our target for IA?
Yeah, it's a good question. We started with the long-term forecast, and I'm gonna ask you to jump in at some point here. Any point, actually. So we start with the long-range forecast to see what are our projections for the upcoming 5 years, and what do we need to do today to make sure that we remain solvent, at least through the next biennium. And that allowed us to arrive at a reduction number of 1.8 million, in addition to the FTE adjustments that we made based on enrollment. And we talked about that previously too. We made a reduction of 8 FTE and licensed staff based just strictly on the decline in enrollment that we've seen over the last few years. That adjustment hadn't been made since enrollment started to decline, so it was time to do that. So the 1.8 million coupled with continued deficit spending. So we've still made the decision that for the next biennium, we will engage in deficit spending. That's how we arrive at the first number.
Yeah.
Then what we do is we look at what are those things we're committed to? What does our strategic plan say that are our values and the programs that we will uphold and that we will continue to invest in? And by we, I mean, as a cabinet and all of the teams that we support, we went through a process of making sure that our investments aligned to those goals. Once we did that to a base level, then we identified where can we reduce. This document that we passed out, this is super high level. It doesn't get into all the details, but this gives you an overview of what those reductions look like for the upcoming. That's like a 30,000 foot level view of what we did. Does that answer your question?
That's sufficient for now, yes, thank you.
Okay.
Right. So the next question that came up over the last week was, in last week's presentation, there was a line item showing that we were reducing curriculum and instruction by 186,000. And so what specifically was that? I was able to break that 186,000 down into 3 kind of subcategories. Reduction in curriculum adoption. This is training, materials, software, combination of everything, but it's across the science, the literacy, the math, and the social studies adoption plans. And so it's not stopping the adoption plans, but it's necessarily reducing how much we implement each year and how much we push each year. So that's 271,000. And then we had a general reduction in the curriculum and instruction department budget of 82,000. And looking at this, there's a lot of items that we reduced. Some of them $1,000, some of them $5,000, or $25,000. The larger items was innovation fund decrease, teacher professional development, summer school, and a bit out of the equity budget. So that was 82,000. And then these were then offset by when we were going through the balancing process and doing all of our grant budgets. We do have a Title II FTE that's been funded out of Title II over the last several years that we were shifting back into the general fund. So the total reduction is higher, but it was offset by a shift in moving that Title I or Title II FTE back into the general fund.
Then the question specific to delaying curriculum adoptions, we can do that sometimes, and we are doing that for the health adoption. I mentioned that before. There are a couple of things that I think are important to note when it comes to delaying adoptions. Adoptions that are delayed do require the Department of Education to approve that delay. We have to submit a waiver, and then the department has to say, yes, you can skip it this year. Along with that, we submit a plan that says how we intend to return to compliance. So any waiver that we submit is temporary at best. We call that a one-time savings. It's not a sustained savings when we do those things. So it provides short-term relief, but not long-term relief. And that is something that, as I said, we have done for the health adoption. Also, something that we take into account when we're looking at reducing curriculum is what is the impact to the work? At the most basic level, our job is to educate kids. That is our charge. And in order to do that, we do need materials that are of high quality. We do need staff that are employing the best instructional practices, which means that we have to have colleagues who can come alongside and train. It means sometimes that we need to bring in outside support to make sure that we are employing those best instructional practices. All of that is looked at And then we identify, and this is the process that Director Loma Lee went through with his team. Then we look at what can we reasonably shrink down for the upcoming budget cycle that won't impact the progress that we need to make in our instruction goals. And that's how we land at the instructional reductions that you saw on the previous slide. I hear every time I've gone through a reduction process like this, I hear from people, well, just stop buying curriculum or just stop the professional learning. It's really not as simple as that because our core charge is to educate kids. And to do that well, we do need some resources and we do need some professional learning. And we need some experts in position to help us with that. So there's a tension in there that we're constantly trying to balance between the real needs of the organization and what we're hearing through surveys and other sources when it comes to curriculum and to what degree we can stop buying. A little anecdotally, in one of the districts that I have worked in, one of the cost saving strategies that they employed for many years was to not buy curriculum. By the time ODE caught up with that, the plan that we had to submit to return to compliance, it wasn't a 7-year plan. 7 years is the typical cycle to get through all the different curriculum. We had 3 years to return to compliance in all curricular areas. That was an enormous outlay of cash for the school district to return to compliance. It is better for us to smooth the expenditures in a planful way than have to catch up all at once. What questions do you have about that?
I don't have a question so much as I have a comment. I appreciate that kind of foresight in a rather unsympathetic era as to funding. Making do with what we have and, for lack of a better phrase, spreading the pain is, I think, a little bit more pound wise than what people have done in the district you mentioned or alluded to. That kind of surgery, you know, is very successful, except the patient died. I think what you're doing and what the staff is doing is entirely appropriate. Painful, yes. Probably unpopular, yes, but absolutely necessary. So thank you for that work.
Okay. Do we have any public comment?
No.
No? Okay, cool. All right, so now we're gonna open it up for discussion and comments from the budget committee. Anybody have anything? Go for it, Dave.
It seems like, given a declining enrollment and a need to reduce expenses as we are, I noticed that our projected outlay for support services is still showing growth from prior years. I'm assuming that's just because the cost of labor is going up. Is that an accurate presumption? And that's where most of the expenses is in the labor, right?
Yes.
For support services, a lot of it is in labor. We also have all of our contracted services, so our Sodexo and Midco contracts for custodial and transportation, and so those are gonna naturally go up every year. Transportation, just because we have a couple of students less, doesn't mean our routes necessarily change significantly, but our rates and costs of the labor and everything still up. So some of that stuff is just our contracted services, and utilities is another big one, and insurance. Utilities and insurance typically go up considerably more than just CPI. So.
Okay. So how do we change the trajectory? Because, we do have to be, as you mentioned at the outset, our enrollment is not going to be growing for a number of years. And so somehow we need to change the trajectory, because this picture that you showed last time of the red and the green lines has been on my mind a lot. And I'm just wondering, are we reducing enough now? Do we have a notion of how we're gonna get that green line to flatten out and not hit the bottom? Because that's our job, right? Just to make sure that doesn't happen. And we can't insist that, we don't have to look for 6 years out, but we can see just in 4 years out that we're gonna hit the bottom if we don't do something.
Well, and there's a lot of assumptions built into that.
Yes.
What is the state school fund gonna look like in the next biennium? What is, negotiations gonna look like in the next biennium? So we can look at it and each year make incremental changes to keep pushing that line out. There's definitely a balance of using, funds today for students of today and, looking long-term. We do have our reserves using, but we also budget conservatively and save every year. So kind of every year looking at that conservative budgeting along with what changes are happening and then just readjusting and readapting so we can smooth that line a little bit. Yeah,
But just based on history in this district. When the budgets start to drop and the funds start to drop, then we have to make hard decisions about reductions in staff and other things. And I think that that the reductions we're probably gonna see reductions over the next 5 years based on enrollment drop. That's just like fact.
Yeah, right.
So I'm assuming a lot of the state school fund reductions have to do with the way the economy is right now. And so if that continues, we're gonna continue to make even more reductions over the next 5 years. And I think I've seen it for the last 30 years. And there's been like this, and I think from when the time that Eileen came in, it's kind of flattened out. It's not like this. So big reductions, don't make any cuts down here. And then next year we have to make big reductions. So trying to smooth that line out, I think, in my opinion, we've seen that from Eileen over the last, since she's been in that position. So
Do you feel like we're smoothing it out enough that we won't?
I think it feels like we're smoothing it out enough. So we have the revenue to make it to the next year, and then we'll look at our enrollment and look at what the budget, how much revenue we have, and maybe we need to make a bigger chunk. So I think it feels to me like we're smoothing it out.
I'm brand new to the school budgeting. I'm
Yeah.
pretty familiar with city budgeting.
Yeah,
And been doing that for quite a while and looking at their reserves. And how many years that would last and so on and so forth. And this is making me a little nervous because. With the city, I can see, well, we're probably good for 4 or 5 years and chances are we'll never dip down there anyway. When I see the projection going down like that one chart showed, it makes me just nervous, and I'll have to defer to your longer term judgment on this if that's not something to be nervous about yet, but. I just have to wonder, are we diving back fast enough? That's the only question I would toss out there.
That's an important question. I think what I wanna highlight is that making these smaller changes consistently over time will prevent the system from experiencing.
No, I'm I totally get that, and I said that, and it's the right way to budget plan for sure, it's just a. Degrees,
Is it
that's
enough?
all it's about.
Yeah,
Are we tweaking enough? That's, don't go hammering one way or the other, like. Economies don't like that.
If it makes you feel any better, for 8 years, I've been sitting on this, and every year or two, she'll be like, we're gonna drop, we have a board objective or guideline of policy that we don't go below 8% or whatever it is in our ending fund balance, and she'll show the projection that in 2 years, we're gonna be at 2%, and we just still have never gone below, probably 10%, so I do have lots of faith
The
in.
city holds a 25% line at their own, and so now you can see why we're.
Okay.
They have a lot. Probably.
Well, actually, this is a much bigger budget than they have.
yeah, it is.
It is.
The one thing I was kind of concerned about is that I'm just worried we're not gonna get as much as they're saying, or as much as you believe we're gonna get in the state school fund.
Hmm.
That's my only concern with this budget.
Possible, if you remember, I said with advocacy,
Right,
we may likely see that 11.4 hold steady. I think our legislators, for those of you who were involved in advocacy, they need to hear how important it is that that number stay steady.
And I'll add to that because I do agree, David, there's a reason to be nervous. I mean, we're talking about existing cuts that we're gonna have to make, but the bigger discussion is happening around the other pieces of Oregon, the transportation that is today not being able to fund their full budget and meeting that. So I was at Lou Frederick's town hall last week and he's chair of education and he took questions from the table and the questions were, where are you gonna find the money to fund our schools and transportation? And he said, you know, where is this community? Where is our community of Oregon gonna find that? The conversation is not even necessarily with the legislators at this point. There are some, Val, to your point, that definitely do not feel like the 11.3 is enough, but there are some that feel like it's too much because they know other pieces are competing for that. But his point was the will of the community, communities like, even in Portland that passed Measure 5 tax, so we could fund some of these pieces. When we're coming back to communities for these bonds and levies, there's resistance to that now, which, so the conversation, I thought it was a really good point, is conversations we need to start having with our neighbors about what is the state willing to commit for the things that we want for our kids and our elders, you know, and when you listen in these Ways and Means committees, they had 10 millions of dollars asked by community members coming to advocate outside of education for long-term care, for transportation. And so I think we are at a point in this state where the conversation needs to start happening with each other and our families and what are our communities thinking around how we're going to be able to support these revenues that we don't have. We're doing a great job with what we do have, but there's a broader conversation outside of this budget committee, a bigger conversation, I think, for a greater state that we're not willing to have, or when we are, people are voting no. We don't want to pay anything else. And then they're telling us, but we would like CTE programs and we need increased activities and we need a rec center in the city, but we're not willing to give any more. So I think that's a really going to be a big discussion going forward.
Well, and something else just to think about, this budget is a best estimate based on what we know at this point in time. So assuming everything comes in and all of the revenue comes in, this is setting our maximum spending limits for the year. Doesn't mean we have to spend those limits.
We almost never do.
And we almost never do. But also if we do see that the legislator passes lower state school fund, it doesn't mean we're going to keep these appropriations and spend. We will have to make internal adjustments and we will have to make decisions based on what resources come available once they close the session.
If I remember right, got some scenarios that you've already cooked up that
We have some
got in
ideas.
your back pocket, you can pull out if you have to, right?
And we've done that before. Multiple times through 2008 to 2013. So, I mean, we've done that.
So one smaller scope question I'll just toss out there. How much of a difference would it make if we reduced the cost of living increase that we're allocating for employees by a small amount, 1%, say?
So
5% is kind of what we're targeting now, right?
in the budget, we have an estimate, but we're still in negotiations.
Yes.
So our budget committee is not setting the cost of living adjustment that we can allocate out. So once we finalize with negotiations, we might then still have to come back to this
The
budget
budget
document.
committee could give you suggestions of what you might want to bargain for, right?
not recommend that.
No.
Nice try.
Ultimately, the board approves the contract at the end of the bargaining.
David, I think if we go back to what we don't do, that's one of the items that we don't do. You spitball on that, I could be wrong. As long as Director Kotke led on the prison break here about other subjects. I've been involved with West Side Economic Alliance, they are very concerned about the economic growth of Washington County and the west side, and their concern is over the, I won't say collapse, but the contraction of businesses such as Intel. In the past, we've ridden the Intel expansion very hard. Even Forest Grove has picked up some of those dollars through gain share and the like. That's gone, and it's probably not coming back with the worldwide economic picture. And with measures, we're celebrating what, the 35th or 36th anniversary of Measure 5, 30th anniversary of Measure 50, those aren't changing. And it's almost as if the state wants us, the voters in this state want us to do stuff, but they want us to do it for free.
The hell's what
And
happened.
that train's left the station. Teachers buying pencils, that kind of thing can only go so far. That's not gonna balance a multi-million-dollar budget. We have to have a serious conversation statewide about what state funding is gonna look like, and it's gonna be painful. Everybody's grabbing for a bigger piece of the pie that's getting smaller and smaller. We haven't figured out how to replace the bridge that's gonna have to go across Columbia if we're gonna be able to continue our economic development and transport of food and goods and services. We haven't done what we can for the transportation issues that plague Eastern Oregon. And we need to continue that. We have not met the challenge that our current administration in Washington, D.C. has thrown in our face about doing less on a federal basis and saying that the states can pick it up. We are facing a potential fire danger in this state this summer that could curl our toes, could bring back, September of 2020. And we don't have the funds to deal with that. Something like that happens again, we are in serious trouble, because we're not going to have aid coming to us from outside. What aid does come from the outside will come from fire departments in California and in Idaho and in British Columbia and in Washington. They aren't coming from our quote friends, close quote, Washington, D.C. So we're in a bind here. And I don't wanna, I guess, whether I want to or not, I'm painting a rather bleak picture. But public education is part of that. Public education is constitutional responsibility. You need to answer that. How we're gonna do it beats the hell out of me, but that's the challenge that we have. And I applaud Dr. West, Director Klute, and the rest of the staff for facing it head on here in Forest Grove as to what we can do. There are some governmental agencies that are not. Multnomah County comes to mind. But we need to be the adults in the room. And on that note, I'll shut up.
I think I have a question for you. What percentage of our budget? I know that we get grants, federal grants and that, but what percent are we getting from the federal government?
It's about 8%.
It's not a big number.
It's not the majority of our resources. Well, Director Kluge set up, the majority of our resources come from the state.
From the state.
Yeah, the vast majority of our resources.
And the other question, I can't remember, but the free lunch for our kids and breakfast, where does that money come from?
Yeah, that's a federal grant as well.
Is that going to be cut, do you know?
As of right now, I'm not seeing anything about that being cut. So I have a little mouse behind me with Lorraine that, all right, that's right. No, that's good. It is partially funded through the state as
Yes.
well, correct? Yeah, so it's partially funded through the state, partially through the federal government. When I saw the news around the federal government floating reductions to nutrition services across the nation, there was quite a bit of blowback. I have not seen any conversation about it since then, and I'm monitoring this pretty closely. I've not seen it crop up again. So I assume for the time being, that is safe.
Yeah, I'm really concerned with prices going up and being a lower social economic community with. Our children need to be fed, and I've been so thrilled that we've been feeding the kids. You know, K through 12. And the stigma, the way we've done it before, that these kids are really gonna need nutrition. Parents are gonna have less money, so I don't know if we can put a plan or a contingent or fundraiser program, but I think it's really essential for the children.
And that is one of the reasons why we need healthy reserves, because if at a moment's notice funding like that disappears, we would not want to simply cut off meal services to our youth. We would want to continue that until the state helps us with some level of contingency plan. And I do know that the state is working on that. There are a lot of contacts that I have at the state that their plans, they're mostly keeping to themselves, but there are conversations taking place at the state level about what would trigger state action in terms of pushing resources to either schools or fire services or transportation or health services. They're trying to navigate that conversation just like we are about what does plan B, C, D, and E look like. Yeah.
Our federal resources from the presentation last week is 4.5% of our total resources. It's about $10.8 million a year. For food services, we get about $2.7 million in federal resources a year. So
What is the total of that? Nutrition budget for us?
the nutrition budget is just over 4 million.
Okay, so it's roughly half. A little over half. Jesus. For the record.
So I had a question that kind of piggybacked on what David was saying earlier on about the support services. So on page 27, the major function. I was saying there was adding essentially just over 7 TE and reducing by 17 on the instruction piece. And then on the major function, basically, so adding the 7, essentially increase the budget by the 2.3 million and decreasing the 17. Change the budget by 1.9. It just didn't quite add up. Where am I off on?
Would you repeat that page number, please?
26 or
26 and
27.
27.
So you're asking about the decrease of this for instruction and the increase of 7 for support services.
Yeah, so decreasing 17 FTE,
Seven and.
but the instruction still went up because there's obviously other things in that.
Yeah.
But
So the instruction side is gonna be partially that, the 8 FTE for license and then classified associated to it. Give me a second, I have the other.
and then was there a section on the 7 support services that were being added on where that was?
That's what I'm grabbing
that
for you
description?
right now. We have. Maintaining 1 FTE for maintenance that's been funded out of ESSER funds for the last few years. We
So
have,
maintaining it is viewed as adding as one of the 7.
it's adding to the general fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, okay.
We have the math TOSA that was shifted from the Title II grant that we talked about. We have an investment in SLPs that we talked about last time. And then we have. Oh. Reserve FTE. Of 3.0.
License.
And so that's most, oh, and the HR benefit specialist is in that too. So.
Thank you.
We made the bid.
While you're considering if there's any other questions, I want to chime in here. I don't want to paint such a bleak picture that we all walk away with our heads hung low. We need to be careful, we need to be conservative and cautious. But we are in the fortunate position of not being in a crisis. There are districts, school districts across the state that reached crisis levels, some recently, they continue to be in the news. That is not us. So long as we are steady, careful, cautious, thoughtful in the way that we expend our resources, make reductions and increments so that we don't shock our system, I believe that we will continue to be okay. And all of that is credited to Director Clute and her team for such good fiscal stewardship.
And do I understand correctly that if things go well, we may not need to be going into deficit very much at all this coming year, but we budget conservatively, so, and we never spend everything we're planning to spend, so if, as usual, we spend significantly less than budgeted, and few things go our way, might we find ourselves really not going into the deficit for this coming year?
We typically save about 5% each year. We will probably still have some level of deficit spending. That 5% savings will allow us to extend those lines you talked
Yeah.
about further and further out. We will still need to do incremental reductions in the coming years.
Sure.
But that 5% savings that we have historically realized is something that the district has come to rely on in order to make sure that we have a soft landing in front of us and not a hard landing.
Does anybody have any other questions or comments? And if not, then I guess I'm wondering how everybody feels about voting on this evening. If they need more time, if they need another meeting to digest more stuff, or if they feel ready to make a vote.
Madam Chair, I move for the adoption of the 24, 25, 26 as presented. And I guess motions 2 and 3 can wait.
Perfect.
We need them in separate action.
Okay, I will, Christie will second. Okay, we'll go through and do a roll call vote and go from there. Brad,
Yes.
Mark,
Yeah, we need discussion first,
Oh.
time, or ask for discussion on.
I feel like we just, yes, but does anybody have any discussion? Okay. Brad,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
thank you, Christie.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah.
Pete.
Yes.
I know. Response. Nicholas.
Yes.
Thank you. David.
Yes.
Jordan.
I'll be the outlier, no.
Okay. Melinda.
Yeah.
Kate.
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Motion 1 passes. Motion 2. I move to have the permanent tax rate on ad valorem taxes of $4.9142 per thousand be applied to the total property value determined by the Washington County Tax Assessor. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. Roll call vote. Brad,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Christie,
Yes.
Peter.
Yep.
Pete.
Yes.
Nicholas,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Jordan,
Yes.
Melinda,
Yes.
Kate,
Yes.
and I am a yes. Okay, motion number 3.
Madam Chair, I move to levy the ad valorem taxes for debt services at $13,587,300.
Great, I will second. One more roll call vote. Brad,
Yes.
Mark,
Yes.
Christie,
Yeah.
Peter,
Yes.
Pete,
Yes.
Nicholas,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Jordan,
Yes.
Melinda,
Yes.
Kate,
Yes.
and I am a yes. Okay, I want to reiterate that we will not be meeting on May 22nd, so please don't come, no one will be here. If there is no further business, I will adjourn this meeting at 6:51. What?
It's not a question. I just want to say thank you. That's all.
Okay.
You volunteered your time to dig into our budget, to ask us the questions that we need to be asked. We've looked at the survey data that we had and asked us questions about that to ensure that we incorporated that into the work we've done. This is what we need in order to put together a budget for a public school system. So thank you for that. As a reminder, we regularly bring our financial reports into the boardroom. So if that is something that you are interested in, you can check in when we have those. And I think we talked about sending the quarterly reports to this budget committee. So we'll start doing that as of the next quarterly report. So again, thank you.
You know, I guess.
1 second, Nicholas got something. Go.
If we are worse than this month, next month, are we going to come back and meet and then talk it over again, or what are we doing as a budget?
Yeah, the budget committee's work is done. If the state doesn't approve 11.4 billion, let's say they come back at 11 billion, we will have to do some internal work to adjust our expenditures. We can't spend more than we receive. So we'll do that internal work. But what the budget committee recommends and what the school board approves is the maximum level of expenditures. We can't go over that, but we can spend below that.
So that would be the school board.
Correct. Yeah,
Got
the
it.
school board and the district.
Mr. Trips.
Yeah, somebody far smarter than I did once said a plan is a budget, the budget's a plan. This budget is planned for the upcoming school year and basically for beyond. It's giving us blueprints to what it looks like, and Dr. West says that is not the most optimistic thing, but we still. And I did not paint an optimistic picture. But I do trust and I do respect the leadership of this district, that includes all of the people involved in the education of our kids. And when Dr. West said that the important thing was taking care of our children, that's hitting the nail on the head. We can talk about other things. We can talk about lines and on graphs that show decreases and increases. But it all comes down to that tow-haired kid in the 3rd grade classroom. What kinds of dreams he or she has. And we have to do our best to make sure that those are realistic and that those are attainable for that child. Dr. West, Director Plume, thank you very much for your work.
Peter, did you have something you wanted?
Oh, yeah, I guess I was just gonna echo a comment that, yeah, if we could maybe see some of the numbers coming along for next year, you know. Assuming that we may need to face more difficult decisions at next year's budget meeting, you know, just sort of seeing where we are and where things are headed earlier. Yeah, might be a good thing.
No, I wonder if we could send out when we do the budget updates or the financial updates in those meetings, if we can send the budget committees the thing saying this meeting is gonna have it. I mean, cause you can even watch it on Zoom after the fact if you can't make it to the meeting, but just so they have a more clear heads up. I mean, even now you guys can go back and watch the meetings throughout the year on the Zoom, but just something to think
The
about.
next one will be the end of October.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Don't wanna end it too soon. Does anybody else have more things they wanna say? All right, so there being no further business, the meeting is adjourned at 6:55.